The studio lights blazed with surgical intensity, casting harsh shadows across the familiar set of Late Night with Jason McCready. In the guest chair, Barack Obama sat with that characteristic lean, relaxed but alert, one ankle crossed over the other knee, his hands folded in his lap. The cameras hadn't started rolling yet. But even in this brief moment before showtime, something electric crackled in the air. The studio audience, packed capacity with a waiting list that stretched for months, buzzed with an anticipation that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. McCready, a lanky 40-something comedian with an unruly mop of brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses that constantly threatened to slide down his nose, shuffled his note cards one final time. His hands trembled slightly, not from nerves exactly, but from the sheer magnitude of the moment. This wasn't just another celebrity interview. This was Barack Obama, the 44th President of the United States, sitting across from him on what would inevitably become one of the most talked-about late-night appearances in television history. The red recording light blinked on. "Ladies and gentlemen," McCready began, his voice carrying that practiced blend of warmth and mischief that had made him a household name. "Please welcome the 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama." The audience erupted. Not polite applause, but a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the building's foundation. People leaped to their feet, some wiping away tears, others pumping fists in the air. The sound was deafening, primal, a release of pent-up emotion that had been building for years. Obama stood gracefully, that familiar smile spreading across his face as he raised a hand in acknowledgement, waiting patiently for the noise to subside. As he settled back into his chair, the former president's presence seemed to transform the entire space. The harsh studio lights suddenly felt warmer. The generic talk show set took on an almost presidential gravity. Even the cameras seemed to lean in closer, as if drawn by some invisible magnetism. "Mr. President," McCready began, adjusting his glasses with a nervous chuckle, "I have to say, it's surreal having you here. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of people, but never someone who used to have nuclear launch codes." Obama's laugh was rich and genuine. "Well, Jason, I have to say your show has always been appointment television in our house. Michelle and I are big fans." He paused, that trademark timing perfect as ever. "Though I should mention, the nuclear codes thing, that's more of a weekend responsibility now." The audience roared with laughter, and McCready visibly relaxed, some of the tension melting from his shoulders. This was going to be good. For the next 20 minutes, they danced through the usual territory: Obama's post-presidential life, his Netflix projects, his thoughts on social media. But everyone in that studio, from the camera's operators to the audience members pressing forward in their seats, could sense an undercurrent building. The real conversation hadn't started yet. McCready's questions grew more pointed, more playful. "Now, Mr. President, I have to ask about something that's been, shall we say, a recurring theme in American politics lately." His voice carried a mischievous lilt that made the audience lean forward collectively. "There's someone who seems to spend a lot of time talking about you. Like, a lot of time. Any thoughts on that?" Obama's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, a spark of amusement, perhaps, or calculation. He uncrossed and recrossed his legs, a gesture so subtle that only the most observant viewers would notice. "Well, Jason, I've noticed that too." His voice remained level, conversational. "It's flattering, I suppose, to still be so relevant in someone's daily thoughts." The studio erupted in knowing laughter and applause. McCready grinned, sensing blood in the water. "I mean, we're talking about someone who tweets about you more than some people tweet about their own families." "That's quite an observation," Obama replied, his smile never wavering but his eyes growing more alert. The man who had stared down world leaders and navigated the most complex geopolitical crises of the 21st century was fully present now, every neuron firing. In the control room, 3 floors above the studio, Director Sarah Chin leaned forward in her chair, her fingers dancing across the switching board. She could feel it too, that electric moment when television transcends entertainment and becomes something approaching art. "Camera 2, tight on Obama," she whispered into her headset, "and keep 4 on the audience. This is about to get interesting." Back on stage, McCready was building to something. The comedian in him recognized the rhythm, the way a joke builds tension before the release. But this wasn't just any punchline brewing. This was political theater at its finest. Two masters of their respective crafts, circling each other with mutual respect and barely contained anticipation. You know what I find fascinating? McCready continued, his voice carrying that particular cadence that talk show hosts perfect over years of practice. It's the obsession factor. I mean, most ex-boyfriends move on eventually, right? The audience exploded with laughter and knowing shouts. Someone in the back row whistled. A woman in the front row covered her mouth with both hands, eyes wide with delight. Obama chuckled, shaking his head slightly. Now, Jason, I think you might be mixing up your metaphors there. Am I, though? McCready pressed, his comedic instincts in full gear now, because from where I sit, it looks like someone just can't quit you. Like, literally cannot stop talking about you. It's been years, and he's still there, tweeting, ranting, obsessing. The former president's laugh was warm, but measured. Well, I've always said that being president changes you. Apparently, it changes other people too. Another wave of laughter rolled through the studio, but McCready wasn't done. The comedian had found his rhythm now, that perfect sweet spot where his wit met the moment's gravity. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes sparkling with mischief behind those wire-rimmed glasses. But seriously, Mr. President, McCready said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register that somehow made his words carry even more weight. If Donald Trump were sitting right here, right now in this chair, he gestured to an empty chair that had been placed next to Obama earlier as a prop for a different segment. What would you say to him? The studio fell silent. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for the next joke, but something deeper, a collective holding of breath. 300 people suddenly became one organism, leaning forward in unison. In living rooms across America, viewers reached for their remote controls to turn up the volume. On social media, fingers hovered over keyboards, ready to capture and share whatever came next. Obama looked at the empty chair for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10, 15. In television terms, an eternity. But the former president understood timing better than almost anyone alive. He had given thousands of speeches, fielded countless hostile questions, navigated diplomatic crises where a poorly chosen word could start wars. He knew that sometimes the pause before the punchline was more powerful than the punchline itself. Camera 2 held steady on his face, catching every micro-expression, the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested deep thought, the way his lips pressed together for just a moment, as if weighing invisible options, the subtle shift in his posture as he prepared to speak. In apartments in Brooklyn and farmhouses in Iowa, in college dorms and retirement homes, in coffee shops and hospital waiting rooms, America watched, not just his supporters, but his critics too, political junkies who followed every twist and turn of the last decade's drama, casual viewers who had stumbled across the interview while channel surfing, international audiences streaming the show online, hungry for insight into the American political psyche. The pause continued. McCready, professional that he was, didn't fill the silence. He understood that he was witnessing something special, not just a talk show appearance, but a moment of genuine political theater. His own breathing had slowed, his usually animated gestures stilled. Even the audience seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Finally, Obama turned back to McCready. His smile had evolved. Still warm, still genuine, but now carrying an edge of something else. Not malice exactly, but a sharpness that suggested the former constitutional law professor was about to dissect something with surgical precision. "Well, Jason," he began, his voice carrying that familiar cadence that had once filled the halls of Congress and echoed through the rose garden of the White House. The words came slowly, deliberately, each syllable chosen with the care of a poet or a prosecutor. "If Donald's still talking about me this much after all these years." He paused again, just for a beat, just long enough to let the setup settle in the audience's minds. Just long enough for the anticipation to build to an almost unbearable level. Maybe I wasn't a president he wanted to replace. Another pause, shorter this time, but perfectly calibrated. Maybe I was the father figure he never had. The silence that followed lasted exactly 1.7 seconds, long enough for the words to penetrate, for their meaning to register, for the devastating precision of the psychological insight to land with full force. Then the studio exploded. It wasn't just laughter. It was a volcanic eruption of sound that seemed to shake the building's foundation. 300 people leaped to their feet as one, applauding and howling with a mixture of delight and shock. The sound was so loud that the audio technicians in the control room frantically adjusted their levels to prevent the equipment from overloading. McCready stumbled backward in his chair, his mouth falling open in genuine shock. His glasses slipped down his nose, and for a moment he looked less like a polished television host and more like a stunned teenager who had just witnessed something legendary. "Oh my God!" he gasped into his microphone, though his words were barely audible over the roar of the crowd. "Oh my God!" The applause continued, and continued. Camera operators, supposedly neutral professionals, were grinning behind their equipment. The boom operator was shaking his head in amazement. In the control room, Director Sarah Chun was on her feet, pointing at different monitors and shouting instructions that no one could hear over the noise. "Keep rolling," she screamed into her headset. "Whatever you do, keep rolling." Obama sat calmly through it all, that same slight smile on his face, his hands folded in his lap. He looked like a man who had just delivered a perfectly ordinary observation about the weather, not a psychological cruise missile that would dominate news cycles for weeks to come. His composure was almost supernatural. While chaos erupted around him, he remained an island of tranquility, the eye of a hurricane he created with 21 carefully chosen words. The audience's reaction showed no signs of subsiding. If anything, it was growing louder. People were high-fiving strangers, wiping tears of laughter from their eyes, pulling out phones to capture the moment even though recording was technically prohibited. The sound had transcended mere appreciation and become something primal, the collective release of years of pent-up tension, frustration, and hope. In the back rows, a middle-aged woman named Janet Hendricks, a retired teacher from Missouri who had driven 4 hours just for the chance to see Obama in person, was applauding so hard her palms were beginning to sting. She had voted Republican her entire life until 2008, when something about Obama's message of hope and change had spoken to her. Now, watching him deliver what might be the most perfectly crafted put-down in political history with such grace and composure, she felt a surge of pride that surprised her with its intensity. 3 rows down, Marcus Johnson, a 25-year-old graduate student in political science, was frantically typing notes into his phone. This moment would be the subject of his doctoral thesis. He was certain of it. The psychology of political communication, the power of humor to disarm and destroy, the way a single sentence could reframe an entire narrative. It was all here, captured in those 21 words. McCready finally managed to compose himself enough to speak, though his voice was hoarse from laughter. "Mr. President," he gasped, "that might be the most devastating thing I've ever heard on this show. And I once had a comedian roast his own divorce on air." Obama chuckled, still maintaining that preternatural calm. "I just try to call things as I see them, Jason." The audience was finally beginning to settle, though eruptions of laughter continued to ripple through the crowd every few seconds as people processed what they had just witnessed. But the real explosion was just beginning. In the control room, producer Mike Torres was already on his phone with the network's social media team. "Get that clip uploaded now," he was saying, pacing back and forth. "Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, everything. This is going to be huge." He wasn't wrong. Within minutes of the clip being uploaded, it began spreading across the internet with the velocity of a wildfire in dry grass. On Twitter, the hashtag #FatherFigure was trending within 20 minutes. The clip was retweeted by celebrities, politicians, journalists, and ordinary Americans who understood they had just witnessed something special. At Sarah Coop 22 tweeted, "I cannot breathe, faced with tears of joy, faced with tears of joy, faced with tears of joy, Obama. Just destroy that man with kindness, #FatherFigure." At Political Junkie 47 posted, "This is why Obama was president for 8 years, and the other guy got voted out after 4. Class, #FatherFigure." At Comedy Gold NYC shared, "I study comedy for a living, and that was perfect timing, perfect setup, perfect delivery, masterclass in humor, hashtag father figure. But the real action was happening on Truth Social. Donald Trump, watching from his Mar-a-Lago residence, had seen the clip within minutes of its upload. He was in his private study, surrounded by framed magazine covers featuring his face, when his aide knocked on the door. "Sir," the aide said hesitantly, "there's something you need to see." Trump watched the clip twice, his face growing redder with each viewing. His hands, never still, clenched and unclenched as Obama's words echoed in the room. The precision of it, the way it cut straight to the psychological heart of their dynamic, the way the audience had erupted. It was everything he couldn't stand about his predecessor rolled into one devastating moment. At 11:47 p.m. Eastern Time, just as McCready was delivering his closing monologue, Trump's response appeared on Truth Social. "Barack Hussein Obama is a failed president who destroyed America, and now he's a failed comedian too. I never think about him except when people ask me about his terrible record. I had the greatest presidency in history, and everyone knows it. Father figure? I am a tremendous father and grandfather. Ask my beautiful children. Obama wishes he could be half the man I am. Also, his birth certificate is still fake." Witch hunt. The post was screenshot and shared across every platform within minutes, and the contrast was immediate and stark. Where Obama had been measured, thoughtful, and devastatingly precise, Trump's response was chaotic, defensive, and rambling. The juxtaposition only served to highlight the power of Obama's original comment. The late-night comedy shows pounce immediately. Stephen Colbert's team had already pulled the clip and incorporated it into his opening monologue before his show had even finished taping. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colbert announced his audience, "we just witnessed a murder, a psychological, perfectly calibrated, beautifully delivered murder." Saturday Night Live's writers were frantically rewriting their cold open, knowing they had struck comedy gold. The Daily Show prepared an entire segment analyzing the moment frame by frame. Even international comedians were translating the joke for audiences, marveling at its surgical precision. But the real impact was happening in living rooms, coffee shops, and social media feeds across the country. The clip had transcended politics to become something larger, a masterclass in grace under pressure, a demonstration of how humor could be wielded as both shield and sword. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a professor of psychology at Georgetown University, found herself fielding calls from reporters within hours of the interview. "What Obama did," she explained to a CNN correspondent, "was identify the psychological dynamic that everyone could sense but no one had articulated so clearly. The obsessive behavior, the constant references to his predecessor, it does mirror certain patterns we see in complex family dynamics. The brilliance of the moment," she continued, "was not just in the accuracy of the psychological insight, but in the way it was delivered. No anger, no defensiveness, no reciprocal obsession. Just calm, almost therapeutic observation. It was devastating precisely because it was delivered with such composure. Political analysts were calling it a masterpiece of political communication. This is why Obama was so effective as a campaigner and president. Observe CNN's Anderson Cooper. He has this ability to defuse tension through humor while still making his point with surgical precision. It's a skill that very few politicians possess." On Fox News, the reaction was more mixed. Some hosts attempted to defend Trump, arguing that the comment was inappropriate for a former president. Others, however, seemed almost admiring of the rhetorical skill on display. "You have to respect the craft," admitted one pundit. That was expertly done. The international reaction was equally swift. British comedian and political satirist Charlie Morrison tweeted, "Bloody hell, that's how you do it." 21 words that just ended a man's entire political psychology. Brilliant. French President Emmanuel Macron's office declined to comment officially, but sources close to the Élysée Palace suggested the president had watched the clip multiple times, apparently studying Obama's technique. Back in Chicago, Michelle Obama was watching the interview with friends at their Hyde Park home. When her husband delivered the line, she covered her face with her hands, laughing and shaking her head. "I can't believe he just said that," she told her guests, though her tone carried pride rather than concern. "That man is going to be hearing about this for weeks." She was right. By morning, The clip had been viewed over 50 million times across all platforms. Memes were already spreading. Images of Obama's calm expression juxtaposed with screenshots of Trump's Truth Social rant, gifs of the audience's explosive reaction, countless variations on the father figure theme. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from an unexpected source: Trump's own inner circle. At Mar-a-Lago, several of Trump's advisors had gathered for an emergency strategy session. The mood was grim. They all understood that Obama had managed to do something they had feared was possible but hoped would never happen. He had crystallized the psychological dynamic of Trump's obsession in a way that was both devastating and impossible to counter effectively. "How do we respond to this?" asked one advisor. "We don't," replied another, a veteran political operative who had worked for Republican presidents. "Any response just reinforces the point. It's a perfect trap. The more he protests, the more it proves Obama's point." But they all knew Trump would respond anyway. He couldn't help himself. It was, perhaps, the final proof of Obama's psychological insight. The story continued to evolve throughout the week. Late-night hosts milked it for material. Political cartoonists had a field day. Academic conferences were hastily organized to discuss the rhetorical techniques on display. Psychology Today published a lengthy analysis titled "The Father Figure Dynamic: Understanding Political Obsession Through Obama's Lens." The article, written by Dr. Marcus Henley, a specialist in personality disorders, examined the patterns of behavior Obama had identified. The constant references to a predecessor, the inability to move beyond comparisons, the defensive reactions to any criticism. These are indeed patterns we often see in individuals struggling with complex authority relationships. Obama's insight was not just clever, it was clinically astute. The article went on to analyze the broader implications. What makes this moment so powerful is not just the accuracy of the psychological observation, but the way it reframes the entire political narrative. Instead of two equal opponents locked in conflict, we suddenly see a different dynamic entirely, one that explains so much about the obsessive behavior we've witnessed. Universities began incorporating the moment into their communications and political science curricula. "It's a perfect case study," explained Professor Maria Santos of Columbia School of Journalism. "The power of precise language, the importance of timing, the way humor can be used to disarm and illuminate. It's all there in those 21 words." Religious leaders found themselves discussing the moment as well. Reverend Michael Thompson of Atlanta's Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Obama had spoken many times, devoted part of his Sunday sermon to the concept of grace under attack. "When someone strikes you," he told his congregation, "you have choices. You can strike back with equal force, you can retreat, or you can respond with such grace and truth that the attack becomes irrelevant." That's what we witnessed this week. The moment also sparked broader conversations about leadership styles and communication. Business schools began analyzing Obama's technique as an example of effective crisis communication. Notice he didn't deny the premise. Observe Harvard Business School's Professor David Kim. He didn't argue about whether Trump talks about him too much. Instead, he reframed the entire conversation. That's advanced-level strategic communication. Even therapy sessions across the country found themselves discussing the moment. Dr. Rachel Green, a therapist in Portland, Oregon, found multiple clients bringing up the interview. "It's given people language to understand certain dynamics in their own lives," she explained. That moment of recognition, when someone identifies a pattern you've been experiencing but couldn't articulate, it's powerful. The clip continued to generate content and conversation for weeks. Comedy clubs incorporated it into their sets. Water cooler conversations revolved around it. Dating apps saw profiles referencing it, looking for someone who can deliver a line like Obama. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from the silence that eventually followed from Mar-a-Lago. After the initial Truth Social explosion, Trump's responses became more muted. His advisors had apparently succeeded in convincing him that continued engagement would only prove Obama's point. The restraint itself became part of the story. The man who had never met a slight he wouldn't amplify was suddenly, conspicuously quiet. 3 weeks after the interview, McCready was still riding high on the success. The clip had become the most watched segment in his show's history. His ratings had doubled. He was booked on every major talk show and podcast to discuss the moment. "I keep thinking about it," he told Jimmy Kimmel during a guest appearance. "The precision of it, the way he waited for exactly the right moment. I've been doing comedy for 20 years, and I've never seen timing that perfect. It wasn't just a joke. It was like watching a master craftsman at work." The moment had indeed transcended its original context. It became a cultural reference point, a shorthand for psychological insight, delivered with grace. He pulled an Obama, entered the vernacular, meaning to disarm criticism through unexpected emotional intelligence. Political strategists studied the moment obsessively. How had Obama managed to simultaneously defend himself and attack his critic without appearing defensive or aggressive? How had he turned his opponent's strength, relentless criticism, into evidence of psychological weakness? The answer, most concluded, lay in the fundamental shift in framing. By recontextualizing Trump's behavior as the actions of someone seeking a father figure, Obama had moved the conversation from politics to psychology, from conflict to compassion. It was a verbal jujitsu move that used the opponent's energy against them. 6 months later, the moment was still generating academic papers, comedy material, and political analysis. It had become one of those rare cultural moments that reveals deeper truths about the nature of power, communication, and human psychology. In her book, The Art of Political Rhetoric, published the following year, Georgetown professor Dr. Jennifer Walsh devoted an entire chapter to the moment. Obama's father figure comment represents perhaps the most sophisticated example of political communication in the modern era. In 21 words, he managed to reframe his opponent's attacks as evidence of psychological neediness, demonstrate superior emotional intelligence, connect with audiences through relatable family dynamics, and do it all with such apparent effortlessness that the devastating nature of the blow was almost disguised by its grace. The genius lay not just in the insight, though the psychological observation was astute, but in the delivery. No raised voice, no reciprocal attack, no defensiveness. Just calm, almost therapeutic observation delivered with perfect timing. It was a masterclass in how to win an argument by changing the terms of the debate entirely. The moment also found its way into marriage counseling sessions, parenting classes, and conflict resolution workshops. The technique, identifying underlying psychological dynamics rather than responding to surface-level attacks, became a teaching tool. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a family therapist in Seattle, incorporated the moment into her practice. What Obama demonstrated, she explained to her clients, was the power of stepping back from reactive engagement and instead offering insight into the deeper pattern. It's a technique we use in therapy all the time. When someone is attacking you, sometimes the most powerful response is to identify what the attack reveals about the attacker's needs. The approach wasn't without its critics. Some argue that psychoanalyzing political opponents was inappropriate, that it represented a form of weaponized therapy speak. Conservative commentators accused Obama of arrogance, of playing amateur psychologists with serious political conflicts. But even the critics had to acknowledge the effectiveness of the technique. Whether appropriate or not, Obama had managed to fundamentally shift the narrative around his relationship with Trump, moving from a story of two political rivals to something more complex and psychologically revealing. The long-term impact of the moment extended far beyond entertainment or even politics. It became a case study in the power of emotional intelligence, the importance of timing in communication, and the way humor could be used as both a shield and a sword. Years later, journalism schools would still be showing the clip to students as an example of how a single moment could crystallize complex dynamics and shift entire narratives. Communication professors would analyze the pause before the punchline. The way Obama's body language remained relaxed even as he delivered a devastating blow, the perfect calibration of insight and humor. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the broader culture's understanding of how to handle conflict. Obama had demonstrated that there was a third option beyond fighting back or backing down. You could step aside and let your opponent's attacks reveal something deeper about themselves. The moment became a touchstone for a different kind of leadership, one that relied on wisdom rather than force, insight rather than volume. In a political culture increasingly defined by shouting matches and personal attacks, Obama had shown there was still power in the well-timed, perfectly crafted response. As the years passed, The clip continued to resurface whenever commentators wanted to illustrate sophisticated political communication. It became the gold standard for how to handle critics with grace, how to use humor as a tool of insight rather than mere entertainment, and how 21 perfectly chosen words could accomplish more than hours of angry rhetoric. The moment had started as late-night television entertainment, but had evolved into something much larger, a masterclass in human psychology, political communication, and the enduring power of grace under pressure. It proved that in an age of constant noise and conflict, sometimes the most powerful response was also the most thoughtful one. And in that studio, on that night, as the audience finally settled back into their seats and McCready attempted to regain his composure, Barack Obama had delivered more than just a punchline. He had offered a masterclass in how to turn defense into offense, how to transform an attack into insight, and how to wield the English language like the precision instrument it could be in the right hands. The father figure comment would be remembered long after most political scandals were forgotten, not just for its humor, but for its humanity. The recognition that sometimes even our fiercest opponents are driven by needs and insecurities that, properly understood, make them more tragic than threatening. In the end, that may have been Obama's greatest achievement that night. Not just winning a verbal exchange, but modeling a different way of engaging with conflict entirely. In a world increasingly divided by anger and misunderstanding, he had shown that insight, properly delivered, could cut deeper than rage ever could, and that sometimes the most devastating response to hatred was simply to understand it.